opportunity. I'd love to get to know you better, maybe have some coffee this week or sometime in the future. You know, I'm 1 week into the grandparent life, and so far the only thing I've learned is that my wife will drop everything in a heartbeat to go down and be with the baby, and that's where she is at this morning, and that's where I'll be next week. One of the reasons why we wanted to get closer, and it's pretty underrated, as those of you who are grandparents know. It's been pretty good so far. We're beginning a new series this morning. We're going to talk over the next few weeks about some of the bigger American idols in our lives. We're going to look at things like politics, traditions, money, sex even. So I hope you'll stay with us throughout this series. And if you miss one, you can catch up online at wscoc.com. There is a tale out of ancient India about 4 brothers who wanted to develop special abilities. And so they decided to scatter for a year, all go their separate ways, and then in a year they would come back together and talk about what they had learned. So after a year had passed, they come together, and the first brother says, well, I have learned to take the bone of a solitary animal and create flesh to go on it. The second brother said, well, if you can create flesh on that bone, I have learned how to make it grow hair. The third brother said, if you can do all that, I have learned how to make limbs and create limbs. And the fourth brother said, if you can create the animal, I can give it life. And so they decided to walk out into the jungle to try to find a bone so they can showcase their abilities. And as luck would have it, they found the solitary bone of a lion. And so the first brother got to work. He created skin. The second brother created the mane, the fur, the hair. The third brother created the limbs. And the fourth brother gave life to the lion. And the lion came to his feet. He shook his mane, gave out a ferocious roar, and he jumped on all 4 brothers and ate them. And that is an apt depiction of idolatry. That is what the idol will do, because we as human beings have the capacity to create that which can devour us. I'm sure you've noticed that the Bible is obsessed with idolatry. It seems to saturate virtually every page. Over and over again, we find the Holy Spirit alerting us to not be devoted to anything other than God. And the theme of idolatry beats us over the head with its persistence, and for good reason, because when it comes to the issue of idolatry, we humans have unlimited creativity. Now, the problem with idolatry is that it's often vague, right? If this were just about creating a golden calf or dancing around a graven image, we could see how that would be wrong, but our idols creep in. They're often subtle and vague. And a lot of times, the things that we worship most are good things in reality, whether it be our spouse, our children, whatever it may be. Education is good. Marriage is good. Work is good. In the right context, sex is good. But here's what idolatry does. Idolatry inserts a substitute for the substance. Idolatry is replacing God, even if the replacement is a good thing, even if it's a blessing from God. If it's a substitute for the holy, righteous, almighty God, then it becomes the sole affection of our hearts. It's no longer good. It can no longer be good if we worship it rather than worshiping the almighty God. In Acts chapter 17, we find Paul in Athens. It is said that Athens had some 30,000 gods. You couldn't throw a rock and not hit a temple devoted to a foreign god. And you know what Paul does? He sees an opportunity. He sees that if these people have the capacity to worship some 30,000 gods, then they certainly have room to worship the one true God. The person who says that they don't have time for God is mistaken. That's a lie. Because you make time for what your heart desires most. But this really isn't about time anyway. Time isn't the issue. The issue is what's preempting God's place. What are we substituting for God? We cannot afford to waste our God-given hours on things that distract us or that pull us away from who deserves the attention most. Here's the problem with idolatry. Every god that we worship exacts a price. Sometimes it's a deadly price, it's an eternal price. Idols demand a sacrifice to keep them happy. So if work is your idol, then it's probably going to pull you away from family. You might suffer in being a father or a husband or a mother or a wife. If sex is your idol, then it's probably going to ruin your marriage. Drugs, alcohol are going to cause collateral damage if that's what you worship. Whatever it is, whatever the idol may be, there's always the potential of sacrificing a relationship with God in order to satisfy the object of your desire. An idol is like fire. It's never enough. An idol never says enough. It wants to spread. It wants to consume. It demands more. The altar of idolatry is terrifyingly insatiable. The more you sacrifice, the more it demands. The underlying deception associated with idolatry is that God is not enough. And our sin flows from this deception. Adultery says, my spouse is not enough. Covetousness assumes that what God has blessed me with is not enough. Pride assumes that I am enough. And idolatry flows from a heart that is unsatisfied with God. In other words, God is not enough. So people manufacture these various idols to fill a void that only God can fill. That hole in your heart, it's a God-shaped hole. So only He can fill it. And it cannot be denied that our idols are willfully created. They don't pop up by accident. They are a desire. They're not innocent. They are conceived in our imagination. They're formed with our hands. They're worshiped by our will. Remember that golden calf incident in Exodus chapter 32? The people urge Aaron to take their gold and fashion this golden calf. And he tries to make some excuse like, I just threw the gold out there and poof, out came this golden calf. It's crazy how that happens. No, this is willful. This is something that we do out of our own volition. And it's not just about a golden calf. It becomes an idol when we worship it. A golden calf is just a golden calf. An idol is just an idol. The problem comes in when we bow down to it. Idolatry lies in the worshiper, not in the thing being worshiped. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. God would not have to relay this command if worship were involuntary. And do you realize that the Bible never accepts man's excuses for worshiping an idol? Never. There is no valid excuse given for idolatry that God will accept. And I think that's because partially what is written in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, where it reads, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Circle, underline, whatever you want to do to that last phrase, so that they are without excuse, because God has plainly revealed Himself. And nature confirms, points to a holy God. And man is left without justification for worshiping any God other than the big G God. So, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 22. It may seem like an odd place to be to talk about idolatry, but we'll get around to making a point. Let's dive in. This is Genesis 22, starting in verse 17. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was old, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. That's actually Hebrews 11, I'm sorry. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So we'll go to Hebrews 11, then we'll go to Genesis 22. We have the benefit of reading the story of Abraham and Isaac backwards, right? We know how it turns out before we even read it. And so we know as we dive into it that it is a test. But consider reading the story as if you're in Abraham's position, as if you don't know how things are going to turn out. So Genesis 22, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you.'" So here's where we start. We start with God's command. You'll notice that this command is unqualified, or it is qualified, I should say, in three distinct ways. Take now your son, your only son, the promised son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you. So let's be clear about what's happening here. Because when we read this story, we tend to do so with a very sanitized view. You know, Abraham's going to kill his son Isaac, and that's tragic. But when you're offering your son on an altar, what does that look like? Well, Abraham would build an altar of stones on one of the mountains. He would then make a platform of wood on the stones. He would take Isaac and he would lay him down on the wood. Abraham would then take a knife and slit his son's throat, just like he would with the sacrificial lamb that was to be slain. Isaac would bleed out. Then the wood for the fire would be lit, and the boy's body would be burned as an offering to God. That's what Abraham was facing. And we read this story with the benefit of knowing how it turns out. And so we don't always grasp the magnitude and the gravity of the situation. But put yourself in Abraham's sandals for a moment and consider that you are him and that your son is the one that God has called you to offer. A little bit different story, isn't it? Chris, if you were to offer Charlie on the altar, that's a little bit different when you place yourself in the position of Abraham and your son in the position of Isaac. And there is no middle ground here. Abraham could have obeyed or disobeyed, but there is no middle ground. He might have argued or tried to reason with God, but ultimately that would be disobedience as well. This episode is referred to as Abraham's test. What is the test? Well, here's the test. Abraham could either believe or leave. That was the test. He could believe or leave. To have a child die before the parents is like putting a period before the end of the sentence. It's just not natural. Children should not be buried by their parents. Should be the other way around. And it is unimaginable for a parent to lose a child. And yet not only does it seem that Abraham is going to experience this unspeakable horror, he's going to be the one that takes his own child's life. And not only is he going to kill his own child, he's going to do it in a most grotesque way. To top it all off, God is telling him to do it. That doesn't seem very godly. Hebrews 11:17 states that Abraham offered up Isaac, which means that Abraham went to Moriah with the intent of killing his son. When he laid Isaac on the altar and raised that knife, his intent was to follow through with God's command. Abraham didn't know. I mean, when he set out on that 3-day journey to Moriah, he had no idea what was going to take place. We do because we read it after the fact, but he didn't know. He just knew that he needed to take the next step. He had trusted God before, and now he must trust him again. Abraham simply lived with this believe and leave philosophy. It wasn't believe or leave. For Abraham, it was believe and leave. Believe in God and leave the details to him. We want all the answers. We'll launch out in faith with God, but we want to know all the details first. Yes, God, I'll go where you are leading me, but what's across the way? What's on the horizon? Can you tell me, is there going to be any adversity? But that doesn't take faith. If you know all the details, that's knowledge, that's not faith. Sometimes our only job as Christians is to put our next foot forward. Not to figure it all out. Not to work out all the details, but to simply keep moving forward in faith, to believe and leave the how to God. And Abraham perfectly illustrates this for us. Verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and do what? We'll return to you." Abraham fully believed that somehow, some way, he and his son would return. God promised to make Abraham the father of nations. God promised to bring forth offspring through Isaac. You know, this seems to be quite a contradiction. If Abraham is supposed to bring forth the nations, if he's supposed to be blessed through his offspring, then aren't we cutting off the promise before it ever really got started? This is the son that Abraham and Sarah had prayed for so long. What does this do to the promise? He didn't know. Abraham didn't know how God was going to handle it. He just knew that he would. He didn't seem to concern himself with the details because he told the men that caravanned with him, "Stay here and I and the lad will go over there and worship and we will return to you." And the young men who were traveling with Abraham must have been confused. They must have thought, how's that going to happen? If you're going to kill him, how are you going to return? But Abraham just kept moving forward in faith. God said, go, and he went. God said, offer your beloved son, so he did. And when God finally stepped in and said, stop, he did. And that's why he's in the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11. That's why he is a beautiful example to all of us, because Abraham believed and left the details up to God. Look at verse 19 of Hebrews 11 again. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So why did Abraham say to the men that were traveling with him, stay here with the donkey and I and the lad will go over there and worship and we will return to you? Why did Abraham tell his son, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering? The Hebrew writer tells us why. Because Abraham believed that God could raise people from the dead. He didn't know how. As far as we know, he had never seen it done before. But Abraham took what he knew about God, he applied it to the situation, and he assumed that whatever happened, even if he had to kill his own son, that God would step in, would bring him back. In other words, Abraham had full confidence that God was in control, and therefore he had nothing to worry about. And this is the peak moment in Abraham's faith. Because what did Abraham really know at this point? Well, he knew that God had promised him to make him a father of many nations. He knew that God had promised to bless the world through Isaac. He knew that God had told him to sacrifice his son Isaac on the altar, but he didn't know how the story was going to end. He didn't know that there would be a ram in the thicket. He didn't know how God was going to reconcile the promise with the offering. But that's what makes the story. Abraham believed, and he did what he was instructed to do, even when it made no sense. Even though obeying God's command meant killing God's promise, Abraham didn't argue, he didn't object, he didn't quit, because there was something, I believe, deep down in Abraham that said, no matter what. I believe you, God, and I trust you, God, no matter what. God is going to come through. Do you believe that? I have no doubt that you want to believe that. I know many of you that are sitting here this morning, and I know that you are people of great faith. You want to believe in the no matter what concept. You want to believe that God is going to take care of it no matter what. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to remove the idols from our lives. If all we're talking about here are golden calves and graven images, that would be one thing, but that's not all that we're talking about. We're talking about the subtle, the vague. It's not always so clear. As far as I know, none of you are sprinkling chicken blood on some sort of statue and dancing around it. That would be a problem. But it's these idols that creep in, right? Our idols come in the form of degrees and athletic prowess and initials at the end of our name. And we get caught up in this. And God gets pushed to the back burner. If you have ever seen the Lord of the Rings saga or read the books, you know who this guy is. Gollum had a hellish romance with the One Ring. And that hellish romance twisted and distorted his mind and his body. It was a love-hate relationship. In one sense, he lusted after the ring, but in another sense, he hated it and wanted to get rid of it. But it became his identity. In fact, it ruined his identity. These idols, they draw us in. We want the glory that comes with them, and that glory bleeds over into beauty and power and wealth and opportunity, and we lust for it, and we want to possess it, but we don't want to just receive it. We don't just want to have it. We don't want to only be receivers. We want to control it. We want to be Lord of it. I mean, that was Adam and Eve's folly, wasn't it? They didn't just want to taste the fruit. They wanted the power that comes with it. They wanted to be like God. The prodigal son, he didn't just want the stuff. He also wanted his father to stay out of the way. He wanted the stuff. He didn't want his father. It's the trap that Gollum fell into, and it's the trap that every single one of us are in danger of falling into as well. If you've ever been or are currently worshiping an idol, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a hellish romance. In fact, that's what hell is, right? It's God giving you over to the idol that you've just been worshiping all along. It's like we're little children. And we come to God with our hands out begging, please, give me a handout. And so God, because He's a loving and gracious God, fills our hands with blessings. And so we have these blessings in our hands, whether it be marriage or children or financial success, a career, whatever it may be. And then God comes along and He says, I want a relationship with you. Here, take my hand. But my hands are full. And God says, well, put that down and then you can take my hand. You're like, well, I don't want to put it down. I like what I have. I want to hold on to it. And so you take what the giver gives you and you cling to the blessings rather than taking the hand of the blesser. It's a crazy thing, but it happens all the time. That's the story of Abraham. Abraham had to reach the place where he was willing to give back to God what was already his to begin with. It was never his in the first place. Isaac was never his in the first place. What about you? If you had to choose between the gift and the giver, who would win? At the end of the day, can you keep the blessings on the proper shelf? Are you more concerned about the gift than you are the giver? Have you taken what the giver has given you and worshiped it rather than Him? It's like one year, my kids were on me about getting a Nintendo Wii. You remember the Nintendo Wii? This was many years ago, and so finally for Christmas, I got them a Nintendo Wii. And from the time they opened it and plugged it in and started using it, they fought over it. They got mad when they didn't win. I gave you this gift. What are you doing? The gift controlled them. It manipulated their attitudes and the way that they functioned. It controlled them. Look at verse 12 of Genesis 22. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Skip down to verse 16. And he said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. So at this point the test is over, right? Abraham passed, Isaac is spared, the ram took his place, and the promise is reaffirmed. Turns out to be a happy story, a troubling story with a happy ending. But I want you to notice God's praise for Abraham. You did not withhold from me. In other words, God says, I asked for your greatest blessing, and you gave it to me. Idolatry makes sense if this is all that there is. If this life is all that there is, if this earth is your only existence, then idolatry makes sense. But if there's something else, if this life is going somewhere, then idolatry is the dumbest decision you could ever make. Because life looks like this. You're born, you grow up, you get married, perhaps, maybe you have children, you have a career, you take a vacation, you retire, and you die. That's it. And you know what your children do? Same exact thing. And you know what their children do? Same exact thing. It's been said that the average lifespan for a human being now is like 78.7 years, which sounds like a long time, but is merely a microscopic blimp on the radar of eternity. You're not here very long. So make the most of your time and make the right choice. Either you pursue the gift or you pursue the giver. But please understand that your idols die with you. Whatever you worshiped in this life, if it's not God, it dies with you. I heard somebody say the other day about a gentleman, he died a millionaire. No, he didn't. He died poor. You can't take your money with you. Whatever your idol is, it dies with you. Idolatry only lasts as long as you live, which means that idolaters are losers now and they're losers in eternity. Look, the only thing that God has promised us is Himself. That's it. Everything else is a bonus. And these bonuses come in the form of money or career or family or whatever it may be. But idolatry is taking something good and loving it too much. Have you done that? I ask you to honestly assess your life. Have you done that? And if you need to take some inventory, I've got a little test for you. This is idol inventory. 3 questions, 3 simple questions. Number 1, do I want this, whatever this is? Do I want this too much? Number 2, has this become too important to me? And 3, how would I react if this were suddenly taken away? And if we're being totally honest, these are not easy questions to answer. Especially when they relate to things like marriage and health and career, all good things, but God never promised us any of those things. And just because you have them now doesn't guarantee that you will have them later. So here's my question for you. This is why we brought up Isaac. What is your Isaac? What is that thing that you need to lay on the altar? That you need to sacrifice? So that you worship the one true God and Him alone. For some, it's not a matter of smashing the idol into pieces, pulverizing it, and then drinking it like they did in the Old Testament. I mean, that would be bad if your idol is your children, right? What needs to come first in your life? It's God. What things need to move out of first place so that God can be placed there? You've heard me say this over and over again, but no one suffers in your life when God is placed first. Not you and not anyone around you. Not your marriage, not your family. In fact, everything functions more harmoniously when God is first. You love others best when you love God the most. Putting God in first place is the most loving thing you could ever do. For your wife, for your family, for everyone around you. You will never lose by loving God the most. Genesis chapter 22, we see what one man was willing to do for his love for God. And it was all foreshadowing, wasn't it? Because at Calvary, we see what God would do for the love of mankind. 1,000 years removed from the story of Abraham and Isaac, David buys a little plot of land. He buys this little plot of land in the same region to build an altar to worship God. The same region that Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac. On that same property, David's son Solomon builds a temple. And another 1,000 years pass, and on that same land, guess what happened? A father sacrificed his son But this time it wasn't a test. This time there wouldn't be any stopping it. God actually sacrificed His only Son. At Calvary, there was no one to shout, "Stop, don't harm the child." There was no ram in the thicket. God's wrath fell upon His Son so that you and I could be redeemed. Think about this for just a second. Abraham offered his son. God offered His Son. Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice. So did Jesus. Isaac was laid on the altar. Jesus was laid on the cross. The ram was offered in the place of Isaac, who was offered in your place. Abraham received his son back alive. And thanks be to God that he received his son back alive. I want to encourage you this morning to do in spirit what Abraham did physically. Lay your Isaac on the altar. Whatever it is that is assuming first place in your life, if it's not God, it's an idol. Even if it's a good thing. Put God first. Let everything else fall into place. Can we help you do that this morning? Do you need prayer? Are you ready to put on Christ in baptism? Are you ready to walk out of here this morning putting God first? If we can help you with that, Steve's got a song. Why don't you come as we stand and as we sing?